focus now we're going to turn to is the disorder of not just carbohydrate, but protein and fat metabolism. So it isn't just sugar diabetes. It's a disorder of all metabolism, but specifically we focus on the carbohydrate metabolism because we have more need for insulin. There's an imbalance of insulin supply versus the need. It's the sixth leading cause of death in the United States, or complications. 2011 stats are probably up to, by now, 25 million and 8 million undiagnosed cases. Huge impact on costs, and we see more common prevalence in Hispanic, African American, and Native American populations. So there's two types of diabetes. And the thing that's so remarkable is this number is exploding, especially for type 2. And you'll see why when we start talking about the type 1 used to be called, and that's insulin-dependent, IDDM is insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus. Type 2 is non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus. That's not to say that a type 2 person won't be able to receive insulin. They can. They may end up needing to. And we'll see why. Type 1 used to be called juvenile diabetes. Type 2 used to be known as adult onset diabetes. And then we have another one called gestational diabetes, and that just means that it's a diabetes that occurs during pregnancy. And oftentimes these, the moms, once they deliver, their glucose levels will return to normal, and all their functions will return to normal. Not fully understood this whole process, why that happens, but we do know, look, that the demands are much greater during pregnancy. There's a lot more blood volume, there's a lot more fluid, there's more needs for energy, and it's really a glucose intolerance that we see during diabetes. Now, what is the difference in all of these? Well, let's talk first about type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is whereby the person will present with hyperglycemia because those beta cells are not producing insulin at all. So they lack insulin. The treatment is replacement of the hormone, subcutaneous injections of insulin, and they're on an insulin pump. It's a lifelong disease. Somebody doesn't cure. Diabetes is not cured. It's controlled. So the beta cells, why would they have not produced insulin? Well, sometimes it's just genetics. Sometimes we think it might be autoimmune. Certainly if somebody has pancreatitis, they could develop a type 1 diabetes. Surgical resections or trauma to the pancreas can cause diabetes. Sometimes in the autoimmune form of diabetes, we will see antibodies that are circulating. They're antibodies against the insulin that the body's producing. It's not against the beta cells. It's not beta cell destruction necessarily. It could be the beta cells are putting out insulin, but the body's own immune system destroys that insulin. What we see is low insulin and glucagon is increased. Well, what does that mean? Their blood sugars are out of this world without insulin because glucagon is increased. We're going to see later all the problems for diabetics. I'm going to separate the two problems for now so you understand what's happening with the disease, but the signs and symptoms of the two diseases are overlapping so much we'll talk about them as one. Diabetes type 2 is most of the diabetics in the world are type 2. With the explosion of obesity, particularly in kids and adolescents and adults, type 2 is no longer called adult onset because we're seeing type 2 in fat kids and fat who are sedentary, who are, you'll see why in a minute. It's kind of amazing. We have, it's again hyperglycemia. Initially, there's no destruction of those beta cells in the pancreas. It's not a problem with the beta cells. And there's lots of insulin, but the cells don't respond to the insulin. The alpha cells are producing too much glucagon. And the insulin, you have lots of insulin, but it's not helping the cells get that glucose into the cells. And it's, we think, because of the receptors. So imagine yourself now, if these receptors are bathed, swimming all the time in high glucose and high carbohydrate, they become desensitized or less sensitized to high glucose. Therefore, they become desensitized and less receptive to the insulin that is present. So if you think about the diets in the country and why are we seeing so much type 2 diabetes, or you'll hear people say, well, I have high blood sugars, I'm borderline diabetic. It means that they've had some fasting blood glucoses that were higher than the normal 100 milligrams per deciliter. And we see a pattern of this. It isn't just a one-time thing, because you all know if you ate a bag of M&M peanuts, the whole bag from Costco, you know those big things, which sometimes I do, not the whole bag in one setting, but I'll sit, and I'm sure I've created hyperglycemia temporarily. I'm not borderline diabetic because my sugars I don't often do that. But when I do, I really do. And some of you probably have, you eat a pizza, it's not just one slice, you might have 3 and then wish you hadn't. We all do that. We all have periods where we have a lot of carbs on board. And or maybe some of you don't eat carbs, and that's cool. But when you have a carbohydrate load, your blood sugar spikes, insulin goes up, you store that, some of it's stored in as glycogen and some of it is laid down as fat, right, if you do it chronically. If, over time, your carbohydrate load is constantly pounding it and saying, more insulin, more insulin, more insulin, the insulin levels in these individuals with type 2, they have high insulin levels. They have high glucose levels because the stored glucose is being put out there as well. And there's less sensitivity, we think, of those receptors on the cell membrane. They just become almost immune or blind to, or not, causing them to be less sensitive and less functioning in binding with the insulin that is there. So these individuals do have insulin, and they do have functioning cells for the moment, but we can't get that glucose into the cell as well. So you'll see these are the individuals when they're borderline. They'll be put on an oral anti-hyperglycemic. They can be medicated. They'll take oral agents, but a lot of times when those beta cells are producing, think about every time you eat a candy bar, you're creating a little bit of demand on those beta cells to spit out some insulin. Come on, do your job, do your job, do your job. And after a while, if you're constantly calling on those beta cells to produce insulin, they get exhausted. They say, I give up. I'm tired. That's one theory. It's called beta cell exhaustion, where those beta cells say, it's too much work for me. I've had it. Stop eating all this sugar. I can't keep up with this demand. And so they start to produce less. Or the receptors on the cells become less sensitive. Either way, what we see is insulin resistance, not absence of insulin. So there's decreased responsiveness to the glucose that is there. The beta cells don't produce the insulin as they should. So you see the difference. One is total absence of insulin. The beta cells don't function. In the other, you're stressing the beta cells constantly, and you can develop high sugars. This is reversible. Type 2 can be reversed with diet, with exercise. Sometimes people will have a period of time like gestational diabetes. A mother can have gestational, which is a type 2. She'll have so much stress and so much need for glucose, and maybe she's having a binge eating because she's got morning sickness and she's loading up on those crackers. She might create a little bit of a type 2, but then she'll correct her eating, she'll get her exercise, and we can see a correction of the diabetes. Type 1 is not, there's nothing you can do about that. Type 2 you can, in some cases, control. Now, so we're, in the country, we're seeing an explosion. You're going to see more people in clinical who have type 2 diabetics. I mean, every other patient has type 2 because we're seeing a lot more obesity and a lot more sedentary lifestyles, which is kind of sad. But anyway, we have diagnosed